I woke up that morning expecting to hear the peaceful rustling of trees and the distant call of birds, just like I had for decades at my grandfather's old cabin. But instead, what I saw made my heart stop. The land where the cabin had stood for over 50 years was nothing but a pile of rubble, with splintered, bricks shattered, memories crushed beneath the tracks of a bulldozer. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled forward, dust swirling around my feet. I had left town for a month to handle some business, and when I returned, the cabin, my grandfather's pride and joy, was gone. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the unread emails. And then I saw it, a notice from the Homeowners Association buried under junk mail. Structure deemed unsafe and out of compliance with HOA regulations. Removed at owner's expense. They had done this. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. This cabin had been built long before the HOA even existed. My grandfather had poured his soul into every nail, every beam. He had raised my father here, taught me how to fish by the creek, and spent his last years watching sunsets from the porch. And now, gone, as if it had never existed. I stormed into the HOA office, my boots leaving dirt tracks on their polished floors. Behind the front desk, a woman with a sharp bob and an even sharper attitude looked up, unimpressed. "Can I help you?" "You destroyed my property," I growled, slamming the email onto the counter. She barely glanced at it before adjusting her glasses. "Sir, the HOA follows strict guidelines to maintain neighborhood standards. That structure was not in compliance." "Not in compliance?" I scoffed. "That cabin has been here since before your HOA was even formed." She gave a slow, condescending sigh. "The land is within the HOA's jurisdiction now. You were sent multiple warnings." Warnings? I had received no warnings, no calls, no letters. Just that single email, conveniently sent while I was out of town. My jaw clenched as she continued, her voice smooth with fake politeness. "It was an eyesore, honestly. The board voted unanimously for removal. We have to maintain property values, you understand." I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. Maintain property values? That cabin was worth more in history and meaning than every cookie-cutter house in this neighborhood combined. I leaned forward, voice low and steady. "You had no right." She blinked, surprised at the anger simmering beneath my words. Then, with a fake smile, she slid a paper toward me. "If you're looking for compensation, you can file a claim with our legal department. But I wouldn't expect much." The board was very clear about the decision. I snatched the paper and walked out, my mind already racing. They thought they had one, thought they could bulldoze my history and get away with it. They had no idea who they were dealing with. By the time I got back to my truck, my rage had transformed into something sharper. Revenge wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. The HOA had stolen from me, and I was about to make sure they paid the ultimate price. I spent the next few days doing my research, digging through every legal document I could find on the HOA's regulations, property boundaries, and, most importantly, the utilities. What I found made my lips curl into a slow, satisfied smile. The HOA had built their fancy new community center right on the edge of my grandfather's land. And guess what? That land still belonged to me. It wasn't much, just a sliver of property, but it was enough. Enough for me to take action. The HOA had been illegally using that strip for years, assuming no one would notice. But now I noticed. I filed an immediate claim, asserting my property rights. If the HOA wanted to continue using that land, they'd have to pay me a hefty monthly fee, enough to drain their budget for years. And if they refused, I'd have the legal right to block access to their community center, cutting off the very heart of their operations. It didn't take long for the panic to spread. Within days, I received a frantic call from the HOA president, a man named Richard, slick, smug, and used to getting his way. "We need to discuss this misunderstanding," he said, his voice strained. "Oh, I don't think there's a misunderstanding," I replied smoothly. "You destroyed my property, so now you owe me." Richard cleared his throat, probably forcing a smile. "Surely, we can work something out. Perhaps a settlement." I let the silence stretch before responding. "You can either pay up, or I start fencing off my land." Your choice. A long pause. Then, finally, let's meet and talk. I grinned, knowing I had them right where I wanted them. They thought they could bulldoze over me like they did my grandfather's cabin. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. I arrived at the HOA's community center just before sunset, the golden light stretching long shadows across the parking lot. I took my time walking up the steps, enjoying the sight of their perfect little world. Neatly trimmed hedges, spotless sidewalks, and that gleaming new building standing right on the land they had stolen from me. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, and inside, a group of well-dressed board members sat around a polished oak table. At the head of it all was Richard, the HOA president, his suit crisp, his smile fake, and his confidence barely hiding the nervous energy in his tapping fingers. They thought they could intimidate me, overwhelm me with rules, documents, and smooth-talking negotiations. They had no idea that I had already planned their downfall. Richard stood as I walked in, gesturing to a chair across from him. I didn't sit. I just leaned against the table, arms crossed, letting the silence build. He cleared his throat, then started talking in a voice that dripped with forced politeness. He explained how the HOA was simply trying to maintain order, how they valued community standards, how unfortunate it was that my grandfather's cabin had to be removed, but that it had been for the greater good. I let him ramble, let him talk himself into circles, and when he finally paused to take a breath, I laid down a single document on the table. A property survey, one they had ignored for years, showing that their precious community center sat on land they had no right to use. The air in the room shifted. I could see their faces tighten, their backs stiffen. Richard picked up the document and scanned it, his jaw clenching as he flipped through the pages. The others leaned in, whispering among themselves. I knew exactly what they were thinking. If this was true, if I had the legal claim I said I did, then they had a massive problem. The HOA had invested thousands into that building, held dozens of events there, poured money into renovations, all while assuming they owned the land beneath it. But they didn't. I did. And now, they either had to pay me to keep using it, or they had to shut it down. Richard tried to recover, placing the paper down with a forced smile. He said there had to be some mistake, that surely there was an agreement, an easement, some overlooked paperwork. I reached into my bag and pulled out another set of documents, county records proving that no such agreement existed. Their claim to my land was built on nothing but arrogance and assumption. The room fell completely silent. For the first time, I saw real fear in Richard's eyes. He switched tactics, offered me a settlement, a small, insulting amount of money in exchange for my signature on a document, granting them use of the land indefinitely. I didn't even glance at it. Instead, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I found a number I had saved earlier, pressed call, and let it ring on speaker. The voice on the other end answered after 2 rings. It was the county zoning officer, a man who had been very interested when I told him about an HOA illegally occupying private land. The entire board stiffened as I casually asked if he had reviewed the files I sent. He confirmed that he had, and in his professional opinion, the HOA was in violation. The best part? Because they had developed on private land without permission, they were now liable for every single improvement they had made to the property. Their expensive landscaping, their custom lighting, their entire building. Technically, it all belonged to me now. I thanked him, ended the call, and looked around the room. The color had drained from Richard's face. He knew what this meant. If I wanted to, I could start charging them rent so high it would drain their funds dry. Or I could evict them completely, forcing them to demolish their prized community center and leave nothing but an empty lot behind. Their control over the neighborhood, their power, their influence. It was all hanging by a thread, and I was holding the scissors. I pushed away from the table, adjusting my jacket. I told them I'd be giving them exactly 48 hours to decide. Either they pay me an outrageous amount in land usage fees, or they packed up and left. If they tried to fight it, I'd take them to court, and by the time I was done, their HOA funds would be drained in legal fees alone. I didn't wait for their response. I walked out, leaving them to scramble for a solution that didn't exist. The next morning, The HOA's desperation became obvious. I got a call from a news station. Somehow, word had leaked about my legal claim, and reporters were now sniffing around for a story. The HOA was in full panic mode, trying to keep things quiet while they figured out a way to salvage their mess. But I wasn't interested in keeping anything quiet. I gave a reporter an interview, telling them exactly how the HOA had bulldozed my family's history without so much as a phone call. And now, they were facing the consequences of their own arrogance. That evening, I took a slow drive around the neighborhood. People were talking. The whispers were spreading. Homeowners were realizing that if the HOA could steal my land, they could do the same to anyone. Some people nodded at me in quiet support, while others looked away, uneasy, knowing that the power they had blindly trusted was crumbling. And then, as I rounded the corner near the community center, I saw Richard standing outside. Phone pressed his ear, looking more stressed than I'd ever seen him. He had just realized something. He wasn't in control anymore. I was. And this was only the beginning point. 2 days passed, and the HOA still hadn't made their decision. I knew they were scrambling behind the scenes, trying to find some loophole, some way to fight back. But there was nothing they could do. The law was on my side, and they were completely exposed. That morning, I drove past the community center, noticing fewer cars in the lot. It was a sign that some board members were probably jumping ship, realizing this mess was too big to fix. By noon, my phone rang. It was Richard. His voice was strained, his usual fake confidence gone. He said the board wanted to meet again, this time with their lawyers present. I agreed, but I knew there was no deal they could offer that I would accept. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about making sure they paid for what they did. That evening, I arrived at the HOA office, stepping into a room filled with tense faces. A man in a dark suit, their lawyer, sat beside Richard, flipping through a stack of documents. I could tell from his expression that he already knew they were out of options. Richard cleared his throat and said they were willing to negotiate. They offered to buy the land outright, hoping a large enough payout would make me walk away. I didn't even look at the number. I told them it wasn't for sale. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and asked if there was anything they could do to resolve this peacefully. That's when I smiled and told them exactly what I wanted. The HOA had to issue a public apology. Not some quiet statement buried in their newsletter, but a real, public acknowledgement that they had illegally destroyed private property and stolen land that did not belong to them. They had to pay for the full cost of rebuilding my grandfather's cabin, exactly as it had been, using the finest materials available. And lastly, Richard and the entire board had to resign, effective immediately. The room erupted. Board members protested. Richard turned red with anger, and the lawyer tried to say my demands were unreasonable. But I just sat back, letting the chaos unfold. Because I knew the truth, they had no choice. They fought it, of course. They tried to argue, to threaten, even to offer me a bigger payout. But they were panicked now. I had them cornered, and they knew it. If they refused, I would take them to court. And not only would they lose, but they would be publicly humiliated in the process. Their entire reputation, their standing in the community, their precious HOA power, it would all come crashing down. They had no leverage, no way to win. The lawyer called for a break, and they huddled together in whispers. I leaned back, watching as the realization set in. One by one, the board members' shoulders dropped, their expressions shifting from anger to reluctant acceptance. When they returned, Richard's voice was flat, defeated. He said they would agree to my terms. I nodded, stood up, and told them I expected the apology letter and official resignations on my desk by morning. Then, without another word, I walked out. The next day, the apology was printed in the local newspaper and posted online. The community was shocked. Homeowners who had once blindly trusted the HOA now saw the truth, that their leaders had been nothing more than entitled bullies abusing their power. Richard and the board resigned, one after the other, their reputations in ruins. And by the end of the week, I stood on my land, watching as workers laid the first foundation for my grandfather's rebuilt cabin. It took months, but brick by brick, the cabin came back to life. Every wooden beam, every window, every detail restored exactly as it had been before. And when it was finally done, I sat on the new porch, just like my grandfather used to, watching the sun set over the trees. The HOA was under new leadership now, quieter, less aggressive. People were no longer afraid to push back against unfair rules. The community had changed, and so had I. I had come into this fight thinking I just wanted justice, but in the end, I got something even better, peace. And as I sat there, feeling the warm breeze on my face, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever take this land from me again.